You know, in the long history of cons and scams, there have been some pretty wild schemes. But what if I told you about a man who didn't just sell a fake product or some bogus stock, but an entire country? A nation that existed only in his head, but that would somehow come to be worth an absolutely astonishing amount of money.
£5 billion. Let that sink in for a second. That's the estimated value in today's money of this completely fictional country. A staggering sum for something that was, and I mean this literally, nothing more than a patch of worthless, uninhabited jungle.
And this is the story of the guy behind it all. A man so charismatic, so utterly convincing that he got hundreds of people to pour their life savings into his scheme and sail halfway across the world to start a new life in a place that didn't even exist.
All right, so let's meet our man, Gregor MacGregor. He was born in Scotland back in 1786, and from a very young age, he was just obsessed with class and status. His one defining trait was this desperate, all-consuming ambition, and he was more than willing to lie, cheat, and scheme his way to the very top.
You can see this pattern starting really early in his life. He joins the army, but instead of, earning his promotions, he just uses his wife's money to buy himself a captaincy. When he retires, he makes up these wild stories about being knighted. But by 1820, it all comes crashing down. A book comes out that exposes him as a coward who literally ran from battle. And just like that, his reputation is completely destroyed.
I mean, his name was basically mud. A writer at the time, Michael Rafter, wrote that for anyone to trust MacGregor again would require a level of madness and folly that's just not humanly possible. In other words, only a complete and total fool would ever believe a word he said again. Now keep that in mind, because what he does next is just unbelievable.
So, with his reputation in absolute ruins in Britain, MacGregor needed a new plan, a new stage, and he found the perfect one. See, the 1820s had this massive investment bubble, and it was all centered on a place most British people knew next to nothing about: South America.
You have to understand the conditions were just perfect for a con of this size. The old Spanish Empire was collapsing, which meant all these new nations were popping up, hungry for investment, and they were offering government bonds with these amazing 6% returns. British investors were desperate to get a piece of the action, but since information traveled so slowly back then, they had absolutely no way to check if any of it was real. It was a perfect storm of greed, ignorance, and opportunity.
So MacGregor, disgraced and broke, heads over to Central America, to this super remote jungle area in what's now Honduras and Nicaragua. And there, he set out to get the one thing he needed to pull off the biggest scam the world had ever seen. He needed a country.
And you won't believe how he gets it. He basically befriends a local tribal leader, a guy the British had given the fancy title of king. And for the price of some rum and a few cheap trinkets, MacGregor walks away with a deed to 8 million acres of land. This flimsy, basically worthless piece of paper, well, that was about to become the foundation of his fake nation, the sovereign country of Poyais.
Okay, so armed with this sham deed, MacGregor sails back to London. Yep, his reputation was in tatters, but news traveled slow, and he could still play the part of a war hero to a new audience. And what he did next was an absolute masterclass in marketing a lie, building the illusion of Poyais from the ground up.
The sheer amount of detail he went into is just mind-blowing. He didn't just tell a story, he created an entire fake reality. He started calling himself the Prince of Poyais. He designed a national flag and a coat of arms, with unicorns on it, of course. He even got legitimate newspapers to print the daily stock price for Poyais bonds right next to real countries like France. Then he wrote a 350-page guidebook, under a fake name naturally, and paid people to wander the streets singing songs about how wonderful Poyais was. He made it feel completely real.
And the picture he painted? Oh, it was a dream. He described a paradise on earth, a land of incredible opportunity, with rich soil, a modern capital city that looked just like one in Europe, a super friendly population, and get this, gold just sitting there, literally sparkling in the riverbeds. I mean, who wouldn't want to go? So he offered a £200,000 Poyais government bond, promising that same juicy 6% return. And in the middle of this investment frenzy, the public just ate it up. They threw money at him, trading their life savings for fake Polyasian dollars, absolutely convinced they were getting in on the ground floor of the next great nation. With the money in the bank, the next, much darker phase of the con began. Hundreds of hopeful settlers, their life savings packed away, boarded ships for the 2-month trip to their new home. But the beautiful dream they'd been sold was about to slam into a brutal, horrifying reality.
McGregor himself was there at the docks to see one of the ships off, charming everyone, of course. A passenger later wrote this haunting line in their diary. It just captures how much hope and trust they put in him. They had absolutely no idea they were sailing straight into a disaster.
The difference between the promise and the reality, it's just sickening. They were expecting a capital city. They found a couple of rundown bamboo huts. They were expecting bustling ports. They found a wild, hostile jungle. Instead of gold in the rivers, they found starvation and malaria. And that friendly welcome they were promised? It was nothing but total, soul-crushing desolation.
And where was the so-called Prince of Poyais while his people were suffering and dying? He was back in London, living it up with their money, throwing huge, extravagant parties, bragging to anyone who would listen about his prosperous new country, all while being completely untroubled by the catastrophe he'd set in motion.
By the fall of 1823, the truth finally started to trickle back to London. The whole scam began to fall apart. But if you think this is where Gregor McGregor finally gets what he deserves, you'd be wrong. This man was a true master of escaping the consequences.
It's incredible. Even when he's exposed, McGregor wins. The newspapers print warnings, the Royal Navy stops more ships from leaving, but when the survivors are rescued, they actually refuse to believe McGregor was to blame. They were so completely conned, they insisted it must have been his associates. It just goes to show you, sometimes it's easier to stay fooled than to admit you were a fool. And McGregor? He just packed his bags, fled to France, and tried to pull the exact same scam all over again.
His talent for getting away with it was just on another level. He gets arrested in France, but what does he do? He blames everyone else, hires the best lawyers, and walks free. The only thing that finally killed his scheme wasn't justice, it was the financial panic of 1825, when that whole investment bubble burst. So he just fled to Venezuela, where his old, cowardly military service somehow got him a generous state pension. He died a celebrated man, still calling himself the Prince of Poyais. So when you look back at this whole insane story, you have to ask, how on earth did he pull this off? And the answer is actually pretty simple. Back in the 1820s, information moved at the speed of a sailing ship. There was just no way for anyone to quickly check his fantastic claims. He exploited that time lag, that gap between the story and the reality, and he wrote it for all it was worth. Which, of course, leaves us with one last thought. Today, a quick Google search would have exposed McGregor in about 5 seconds. We feel like we're protected by how fast information spreads. But you have to wonder, does that very speed create new ways for misinformation to spread, for new kinds of scams to pop up, hiding right there in plain sight? It's definitely something to think about.